I want to take a nuclear message and take it down so that it's accessible, to everyone, but especially to children, to feel that there is actually such a thing as a bright future coming our way.
The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
Hello, John. Welcome to the Titans of Nuclear podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on here.
No, thank you very, very, very much. It's a great honour to be here. Having been a long-standing fan, it's great to be here.
Yeah. We have quite a lot to discuss, but before we get into it, could you just introduce yourself to the audience and tell them how you got into nuclear in the first place?
Yeah, no, sure. So my name is John Lindberg. I am originally Swedish, despite the accent, but I've spent sort of the last 8 years living in various parts of the UK. So at the moment, I do my PhD at King's College London and at Imperial College, focusing on radiophobias and risk perceptions around nuclear and radiation. Alongside that, I also work with comms at the World Nuclear Association. But my journey into nuclear is anything but straightforward, I would say. So before coming to the UK, I had the dream to become a doctor. But then I realized that blood and I is not a good combination. And being afraid of blood and wanting to become a doctor didn't quite seem to match up. So I decided to throw that to one side and naturally wanted to go into politics. So moved to Scotland, studied political sciences at the University of Glasgow for 4 years. And really almost by accident, I got myself first an internship and then a position as political advisor in the Scottish Parliament, where I advised one of the members on all matters energy, the environment, and foreign affairs. And I'd always been fascinated by nuclear, but I'd never quite considered it as a career choice. So when I grew up in southern Sweden, we have a disused uranium mine just a couple of miles away. And, I grew up with the stories of Chernobyl, so I knew of nuclear, but I never quite thought of it. And then when I graduated and also left the Scottish Parliament, I seriously actually had to sit down and think, what do I want to do when I grow up? And I still don't really know what I want to do when I grow up, but nuclear definitely struck me as a field of interest because I've always been very passionate about climate change and building, if you like, cliche as it is, a better tomorrow. So decided then to move to London. I did my master's at King's College London in climate change and risk comms, and ever since really it's been nuclear. It's been working for think tanks on nuclear, both in London and a short stint in California. I worked for the UK government advising on nuclear, and now the natural choice is to do my PhD and to work for the World Nuclear Association. So in a very short, that's how I got here.
I just want to jump right into your very interesting topic or research topic for your PhD, which is radiophobia. And before we kind of get into it, I want to set kind of a context to this. You mentioned earlier you grew up next to a former uranium mine. And part of an article you shared with me, one of the opening statements, I just want to read out about what that experience was like. So, open quote, the initial fear was, however, quickly replaced with a kind of apathy. Most of us have felt this at some point towards climate change. It's just became so big, too frightening, and too disembodied. I guess it was my brain's way to try to protect me. And a perfectly natural response, which was so commonly seen in any climate change debate that is around us, end quote. And I think that very perfectly summarizes how most of the conversation goes around climate change. So I want you to talk about your interest in research topic about radiophobia and how you decided on that initially.
So I suppose it's sort of quite similar to my long and winding story about how I got into nuclear. My research interest into radiophobia only really started because back at school, so before university and all of that, we had to do it was a small project where we compared all the available large-scale energy sources through the lens of climate change. And it quite quickly became clear that coal, oil, and gas clearly not really going to fly if we were going to address climate change. So that was quite easy. But then we started looking at hydro, and hydro is great, but not all countries are blessed with it. So I'm currently in Sweden now. Our neighbours to the west in Norway, they are clearly just blessed with all of it because they have 100% hydro more or less. But other countries have nothing. So it was clear as well that it's a bit hard to just bet on Mother Nature having given you enough waterways to build hydro. So really what was left in that task was nuclear and then variable renewables. And my teachers told the class that nuclear is great. It doesn't really emit anything. It's waste or be very radioactive. It's really quite small if you compare to other energy sources. But always that minor detail as well that when something goes wrong, it goes horribly wrong. Chernobyl obviously came into the conversation at that point. And I was like, yeah, Chernobyl killed anything between 200,000 and millions. And the mental image that our teachers gave us was sort of a desolate, completely devoid of life zone around Chernobyl, half of Eastern Europe. And we were 16, 17 at that point, and everything that we've ever heard about nuclear was seemingly in line with what our teachers told us, and no one really challenged that. So I sort of left school thinking that, yeah, it's great, but bloody hell, it is dangerous. So maybe let's skip that and stick with the renewables. But then I remember that in Parliament, there was a question at one point that my boss asked me. It was like, John, nuclear, we got a couple of reactors up here in Scotland. How dangerous are they really? What does the evidence actually say? Because he just had a sort of deputation between Greenpeace on the one hand and a couple of days later, someone from the energy companies. And they provided my boss with just such vastly different figures. So, as an advisor, I was tasked to find out the truth. And that's probably, so this is 2013. And at that point, I started realizing that, hold on, Chernobyl, albeit a great travesty, no one's ever going to dispute that, it isn't quite the travesty that my teachers made out. It isn't, hundreds of thousands or millions of people dead. You can't really hide that. But yet all of the evidence that's out there is saying, yeah, we know for sure that probably 100, 150 people. Beyond that, it's all inferred. And I suppose then it was almost like, like you started to slice up the nuclear sausage. Accidents were discarded, but then I started looking at, okay, fine, accidents clearly not as dangerous as people would have it. But then, okay, the waste issue, that must be so dangerous. Or, yeah, clearly it's a weapons factory. So bit by bit, I started to realize that the stories that virtually all of us grow up with around nuclear, that they're clearly completely divorced from reality. And then I wrote both my my undergrad and my postgrad thesis around radiophobia, looking at why is it that we have such a differing view between what people actually think happens at nuclear accidents, for instance, or how people generally perceive the risks of nuclear energy broadly, and compare that with the facts. And that there's a chasm. There's it's a proper ocean in between. And at this point, I was curious, or if you ask my friends, probably slightly obsessed with trying to find out why do we have such different worldviews, and the evidence has been there for decades. Why haven't we really gotten rid of the radiophobia? Less than 10 years after Chernobyl, when we realized what a worst case nuclear accident actually would look like.
This is very interesting. And do you think that being in the political landscape kind of helped you shape these opinions a bit more strongly in your formative years, I think, in your career?
I mean, totally. I think politics has taught me a great number of things. Some good, some bad, some perfectly shareable, and some of them probably slightly more shady. But one thing that politics truly taught me is that facts, albeit important, albeit, it should underpin what we do, fact is always going to be secondary to perception. What is perceived to be the truth is almost more powerful than the truth itself in many cases. And ask any politician, it doesn't matter, frankly, in many circumstances, if you got the facts on your side. Sometimes you do, but you're perceived not to have the facts on your side. You're perceived to be doing something that you might not. And it's that perception that is going to govern to a large degree how people perceive you and their actions accordingly. So yeah, having done my formative years in politics, it's definitely helped me, if you like, understand more powerfully the importance of imagery and of emotions.
So since we are in the situation where facts don't necessarily drive actions, is it fair to say that it's an ideological problem? It's an emotional response to these things, almost through your research.
Yes, I mean, here people will have very different views, and the science, if you like, behind this is still a bit up in the air. Yeah, it is ideology, it's worldviews, and it's also the fact that we aren't born being afraid of nuclear energy. We're not born being afraid of radiation when it comes to a nuclear reactor. This is something that we grow up with. We're socialized into these fears, and if you like, our culture has, over the decades, become more and more radiophobic. And, it doesn't quite matter if you read books from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, up until practically yesterday, watching films, TV series, you can tell a very, very, very strong undercurrent in not just the political discourse and debates, but even in pop culture. And, pop culture has a massive impact on how we make sense of the world. None of us have all the time in the world to sit down and flick through the facts about every issue that that we are bombarded with. We have to be selective, and in many cases we then fall back onto the way that we generally see the world, or worldviews, or ideology, if you like. We also fall back to not just the sort of the strong emotions that we have, but also, if you like, what's called affect. So a sort of faint whisper of emotion, that sort of mental shortcuts, the heuristics that we all have inside of us. And 95% of all the decisions we make are done almost purely on instinct, or rather, what do we know from before? And that's very much the case when it comes to radiation as well. And I did a very interesting study a couple of years back, looking at how has popular culture changed over the last, started in the sort of late 50s up until now. You can tell that it started with the bomb, it started with radiation from the bomb, then the radiation from the bomb swapped sides, it started becoming associated with the reactors. You have, films like the China Syndrome coming out just before 3 Mile Island, which then just reinforced the notion what a nuclear accident can be. And so on and so forth. So we very frequently fall back to these sort of upbringings and social, I don't want to say social constructs, but the social environment that we act in. And given that that is very strongly radiophobic in most parts of the world, it isn't really it isn't strange that most of us are actually quite radiophobic.
And going into the cause of most of the radiophobia is this general misunderstanding on what nuclear energy is, and it's most importantly for the regular person differentiating nuclear energy with nuclear weapons per se, and most importantly around radiation and nuclear waste. So can you just talk a bit about that? How much have you found that in your research has this disconnect between information and reality really influenced people's perception of nuclear?
Yeah, there's a very, 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 very strong evidence that emotionally we don't quite differentiate between weaponry and nuclear energy, if you like. In many cases, survey work has found very strongly that when people are interviewed about what do they think a nuclear accident looks like and the aftermath of a nuclear accident looks like, when you look at how they describe these scenarios and the imagery and the sort of the emotional response that they give, and then compare and contrast with, if you like, footage from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or more how pop culture have portrayed the aftermath of nuclear war, you find that the connection is astounding. People are more or less describing the aftermath of a nuclear bomb when they think aftermath of a nuclear accident. And as much as the nuclear industry has tried over the years to try to park nuclear weaponry and nuclear accidents, not nuclear accidents, park nuclear energy and nuclear weapons apart from each other, unfortunately, that sort of mental connection between the two of them is probably never going to go away, because radiation is radiation in people's minds. And if you have fed them imagery that looks more or less the same over decades, it's going to be very difficult to undo that connection, unfortunately. And the research is showing again that it is by and large emotions play a huge role in how we perceive nuclear and the risks that we perceive. Yes, we can continue to talk about stuff like climate change, but most people that are convinced by sort of nuclear is good for climate change, therefore nuclear is good, are people that are already quite, either pro-nuclear or quite lukewarm, or sort of easier to get across to the pro-nuclear camp, if you like. So you need to find different ways of appealing to people's emotions when it comes to nuclear. And it's also a question of creating a new sort of imagery, because nowadays, if you Google nuclear accidents, nuclear waste, you will find a lot of very horrifying imagery. Most of it is clearly not true, but it's nevertheless the discourse and the imagery that we operate within. And if the nuclear industry doesn't provide really with different emotional appeals and imagery, this is going to be the story that continues. That's the master narrative that has been so entrenched. And, if you look at it over the last 30 years, the industry has tried very hard to get a new sort of narrative around it, betting heavily on climate change. And, climate change is important. That's one of the reasons I work with nuclear. This is one of the reasons I research around nuclear and trying to make sure that we can build much more nuclear. But climate change isn't clearly going to be a one-size-fits-all solution for this.
Now that we've laid a very good foundation of what radiophobia is and how it kind of expresses itself in society, how do we go about communicating effectively? Because you mentioned earlier about your background in politics, that having the right things to say sometimes are probably a bit more important than having the facts on your side. So how do you manage having the right facts and still managing to say the right things that actually moves people to want to change opinions? Or maybe not change opinions, but at least start to listen and have productive conversations, at least as a first step.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. In politics, having some sort of facts normally helps. Otherwise, you tend to be called out on not having the facts, and that tends to be a bad idea. It's building trust. Building trust with the public, with the media, is so important. I can't stress that enough. If they don't trust you, don't bother, essentially. And the nuclear community, so let's park the industry aside and just broadly nuclear, have had the tendency, and especially the industry, if you like, to talk facts and just, let's get as many facts in as possible. Let's really shove facts down people's throats, and then they will probably see the light. There has for a very long time been this notion that as long as you tell people that nuclear is safe, that nuclear is good for, little waste, whatever not, but just give them the facts and they will see the light. That hasn't worked. That has never worked, and it's never going to work. Yet a lot of people in the nuclear sphere, unfortunately, continues with this. And that's always going to be an issue, because most people are not driven by facts. We are driven by emotions. Everyone's like that. And I think, as I alluded to earlier, the nuclear community needs to start talk about nuclear in a different way from what we have now. Because now it's almost like being apologetic. That, yes, nuclear, I'm really sorry, but we want to build a reactor. We've built a reactor here. We generate a lot of electricity and very little emissions. But, sorry for being here, sorry for disturbing you. I think people need to be, in the nuclear sphere, be more unapologetically pro-nuclear. Be proud of what you do. And, I've been fortunate enough to travel to nuclear power stations and talk to people literally on the floor. I've spoken to operators and people literally standing on top of nuclear reactors. And there are few people that I've come across that are as proud about what they do as people that work in the nuclear industry. Yet you never hear that, or very rarely hear that. And I think that's a massive problem. I think that, part of that is probably the fact that we don't empower our employees, or we, the nuclear industry, empowers its employees to actually talk about why nuclear is great. It doesn't always have to be, and I know that I'm probably talking myself out of a job now, but it doesn't always have to be this polished, public relations, going through people that do spin for a living like yours truly. It doesn't have to be that. Sometimes it's more powerful to have that raw story that comes straight from the heart, from someone that's been, my favorite power station in southern Sweden, Ringhouse. I know people there and have heard stories about someone's grandfather. They built the reactor, then they worked as an operator, and their children are now working at the same power plant. And the source of pride that this gives to people that work there, it's an incredibly powerful story. And it's a story we never quite hear. So dump the facts as sort of the key driver. Make sure you have the facts on your side. Get the personal story there, and then start to really hammer home the sort of the vast plethora of great things that nuclear can do, be it low carbon electricity, be it employment, be it energy security, be it desalination, be it what, SMRs and the advanced reactors can do. Be unapologetic about why this industry is so darn good, pardon my French. And by doing that, I think we'll get far. We'll still have to deal with the fact that, our detractors are going to come and say, well, nuclear is so dangerous. We don't want another Chernobyl. And I agree, no one wants a Chernobyl. I don't think anyone would ever challenge that. But the thing is, we can't keep on banging on about just how important safety is to us. Yes, safety is important. Safety is important to literally any industry. Yet this is the only industry that, as almost like a PR stunt, stands up and say that safety is always going to be our number one, and we are not going to operate unless it's perfectly safe. Yeah, that's pretty much a no-brainer. I don't think most industries wouldn't quite operate unsafely. Yet we have made that almost internalized that as a source of pride. But then the perception of that, if we go back to that, is that most people know corporations and industries to want to make money, which is fair enough. You don't go into business to lose money. Yes, here you have an industry which is claiming that they are perfectly happy to make massive losses on the account of safety. The message that this is thus sending to the general public is that, oh, crikey, This is an industry which is so uniquely dangerous that not even industrialists want to make money. Good God, do we really want to be involved with that? And that's a problem. We should be proud of our safety record. No industry is arguably as safe as the nuclear industry. And that's great, but don't make it the unique selling point of our industry when we have so many other really, really, really great features that we should be promoting as much as possible instead.
This sounds really good in practice, but I'm curious about your own experience since you move in very different circles that you have throughout your entire career. Does the attitude change between academia and actual practice between industry folks? Do you see any disparity in the way they talk about it and the way they act towards solutions around it?
Oh, massively. I would probably split it out in three different constituencies, if you like. So you got academia, you got industry, and you got policymakers. I suppose those are the three main circles that I move in. And in academia, risk perception research and risk communication research around nuclear has been going on more or less since the 50s. Nuclear has always been a case study for risk management, risk assessment, risk perception, risk communication. Nuclear is incredibly well researched. We really understand how people perceive nuclear and how they relate to it. Be it nuclear energy, be it siting issues, be it nuclear waste, be it weaponry, be it uranium mining. This is quite well researched, and there's a lot of very interesting materials out there. So in the academic community, I think it's now moved on more almost into like psychology. So stuff like what I do around radiophobia, how do you change perception rather than establishing what the perception is? So changing perceptions, or how has nuclear created geographies around communities, be it around, once again, nuclear reactors, given that you see that the closer you get to a reactor, the more positive towards nuclear people get. Be it people that live in, say, Nevada, around Yucca Mountain, how they relate to it. So that's how the academic community, they moved on from more why do we perceive, so how do we perceive it to why do we perceive it that way. Industry, on the other hand, to my experience, have had a bit of an issue when it comes to taking on board all of this research that's sitting in academia. And part of that is sitting firmly with academia. It isn't accessible enough, and that's always been a problem. There's a lot of good research that doesn't actually make it into industry circles or policymaker circles. And that's sort of where I see myself sitting in sort of the triangle between the three of them. I take the academic research with me when I speak to policymakers or when I do my job in industry. So industry have had a bit of an issue when it comes to internalizing this. And, you can go to conferences and you would hear, splendid presentations being made about how do we communicate about nuclear. The rather depressing fact about that, however, is that they report findings which are maybe 3 to 4 decades old, but make it seem like, oh, this is, hot off the press. And that's a problem. I think the industry hasn't quite caught up with where academia has gone. And then if we go into the third circle, which I probably think is the most interesting to me, the policymaker circle, you find that, a lot of it is, how do you sell nuclear in 2 minutes? How do you dispel the myths around accidents? How do you dispel the myths around waste being absolutely lethal for eons? So that conversation is very, very different. It's a typical elevator pitch, essentially. And you find that you need someone to go into that environment that actually has been in that environment, because politics operates according to its own rules. And if you send in someone from academia or from industry that has done that sort of jobs, brilliant. But if you don't, you will find that someone will still be going on, if you like, doing the introduction 10 minutes in, and the politician has more or less already left the room. So you find that the conversations are so very different. And with policymakers, it's unfortunately much more, okay, how do I win the next general election? That's by and large what will drive a politician. So if you speak to them, you need to frame it around what actually matters to them. If you speak to someone that doesn't care about climate change, you obviously can't talk about climate change. If there's someone who's made his or her name in energy security, then you need to obviously tailor your messages, which obviously isn't rocket science, but I think that that's something that, we've gotten ourselves very comfortable on the climate change messaging, but that doesn't always work. For instance, if you work in America, you find that a lot of the current administration probably don't really quite care about it. And climate change is also not always the most motivating of issues, because it's so far into the future. And if the politician is facing re-election in 2 years' time, focusing on an issue that's 25, 30, 40, 50 years down the line, they are simply not going to care.
That's climate apathy, as you put it, very, very, very well in one of your articles. And speaking of your articles and more the videos you've published on YouTube, on various other places when you've been giving talks, this is a constant challenge that you're trying to explain, and you refine your message every time. And one of your other projects that I found quite interesting is the children's book that you're planning to write. So what other ways do you use to just refine your message? Because as you mentioned, you have to consistently tailor your message to who you're speaking to, so it has the maximum amount of impact. So how do you keep yourself on top of everything with the projects that you do, and what do you plan for going forward with the rest of your work?
So I spend a lot of time speaking to my friends who are not in the industry, trying my messaging on them. I honestly spend quite a lot of time trying messages on my 79-year-old grandmother, who is absolutely vehemently anti-nuclear. She, every time I talk to her about what I do, she's like, "John, could you please work in literally any other industry? Just please don't do nuclear." And I find that to be really, really helpful, because my grandma, she remembers Chernobyl really well, and she's told me a lot of the stories about how the weather was a bit weird, and how all of a sudden it was raining, and hundreds of thousands of worms came out of the ground. And I was like, these sort of really weird stories. So trying messaging on someone like her, who will always be vehemently anti-nuclear, is really quite helpful, because then you find what frames work better. She's elderly. She remembers nuclear weaponry. She remembers being so afraid of nuclear weapons. That's something that my generation, we know of nuclear weapons as a concept. We know that we don't want nuclear war. But if you ask someone that grew up in the 40s and 50s and really remembers the Cuba crisis, or sort of the 1980s, when nuclear war really seemed like, yeah, it's going to happen, it's just a question of time, different messaging is used to them. I spend a lot of time talking to people that I know who are very, very passionate, for instance, about the environment, who also they're probably quite agnostic, frankly, about nuclear. But that's another sort of group where trying messaging really, really helps. One of my best friends is a senior politician in the UK, so I can try out messaging on him, if you like, in a safe environment before I take it out onto the field. But yeah, as I said, a lot of my long-suffering friends have to listen to me rambling on and trying different messaging strategies. And look, it's been a lot of trial and error. I've found certain messaging frames that have worked better, and some that's worked, disastrously, if we're not going to beat around the bush. And as you alluded to, one of my many projects that are sort of in the pipeline is I would want to take the opportunity to take the nuclear messaging and take it down to literally the level of a child. Because, we grow up hearing about the environment, about climate change. My young cousins, who are, all less than 15 years old, they've grown up with climate change. And only a couple of weeks back, we sat down for, a corona-friendly barbecue outdoors, and spoke about what I did. And I said, well, I work in nuclear. And said, oh, so this is my cousin who's 9. She's like, oh, do you work in nuclear? But isn't that really, really bad? Isn't that really, really dangerous? Isn't that killing babies and whatever have you? And, then we had a long conversation around that. And then she said, well, if you work for climate change, why are you not doing anything? My future is at stake. What? And, you didn't quite, I at least didn't quite expect to hear that from someone who's, 9 years old. And this sort of profound, concern about the future. And I think nuclear isn't just a climate message, but nuclear has a wonderful climate message. And I think that and this is the reason I want to do this sort of children's book. I want to take a nuclear message and take it down so that it's accessible, to everyone, but, especially to children, to feel that there is actually such a thing as a bright future coming our way. We need to dare to dream again. And this is not just about nuclear. This is critique that I have generally around the sort of the political and climate change discourse that we operate within. It's all very doom and gloom. And, part of that is because bad news sell. The media will always pick up bad news stories 10 times before they consider a good news story. Unfortunately, that is the way that the world operates. But the problem with that is that, and, you read my quote from earlier, I find myself being deeply apathetic about climate change after having been absolutely terrified after having watched The Day After Tomorrow. And, I know that The Day After Tomorrow has scientific flaws big enough that you can probably drive a car through them. But nevertheless, I grew up with this, and for me, this was climate change. And to a degree, this is always going to define what I think about climate change. And this sort of the societal debate that we have today and that young people grow up in is very doom and gloom. And I think that's something that we need to address. And, the nuclear industry has a message of a brighter, fairer, more equitable tomorrow that I think will give young people that sort of message of hope and something to build on. Something that, would also benefit the nuclear industry, obviously, but there is that sort of messaging out there. And I think getting it to young people early on is really a no-brainer. So that's probably, of all the many projects that I have in the pipeline, I'm also working on a book on radiophobia broadly, but of all these projects, it is really the sort of children's book. And I'm currently having conversations with a couple of artists around how to illustrate it. But to get that messaging out there, that, that climate change is scary, nuclear isn't, and with nuclear we can actually build a jolly good future, if you like.
And I would also like us to end on this hopeful note that you started on. What are you most excited for in the future of nuclear energy, in the policy space, or just in the communication space? And you're dispelling the myths about radiophobia and the work that you're doing. So what really excites you in the next few years about nuclear?
So I am a massive technology geek. I am personally so excited about what's coming in the pipeline, be it advanced reactors, be it thinking about nuclear waste management in different ways. So, there is so much exciting stuff going on in, small startups to really big firms. And, this is something that I really look forward to, and to see that hopefully, I'm not going to use the word renaissance because I think this industry used it so many times and it never quite came to fruition. So I shall not jinx it. But I think that the future of nuclear could be really, really bright. There is so much interesting technology. There's a lot of, young entrepreneurs out there that are now thinking about nuclear in very different ways from how we've done it over the last decades. So that's all, jolly interesting and jolly exciting. In the communication space, I honestly, I hope that one day I can stop talking about radiophobia and do something else. Because sitting and reading about the effects of radiophobia, be it, the abortions after Chernobyl, be it how people are stigmatized after Fukushima or Chernobyl, be it about, school children being bullied just because they happen to live in the Fukushima prefecture, stuff like that is utterly depressing. And I hope that hopefully we'll be able to get our comms ducks in a line and get the comms strategy working for nuclear, get radiophobia out of the picture altogether. It will take decades. I am not going to lie about that. But, one day I would like to do something else in the nuclear space that isn't radiophobia. Be it, literally selling reactors around the world. I would love that job, bringing nuclear into new places. There are hundreds of millions of people that literally live in the dark, no access to electricity, which is unacceptable. It was unacceptable decades ago, and in 2020 it's even more unacceptable. And I would love to be able to do that, go around and if you like, bring the atom with me and just show just how brilliant this technology will be for the future.
Perfectly said. John Lindberg, thank you so much for joining me on this Titans of Nuclear interview, and I really appreciate this conversation.
No, thank you ever so much.
My pleasure.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.